Okay, everyone, just a short video now that I'm becoming a Hyrox expert, a self-titled Hyrox expert, having done 3 races now and about 6 months of dedicated training. I'm just going to highlight what I think I'm learning about it and why sometimes your first impressions might actually be wrong about the sport of Hyrox. Firstly, it's despite what you see and the fact that most people enjoy taking the tops off and looking great, ideally, under the lights. It's not about strength. It's much more defined by a threshold effort. As we know, for the majority of people, perhaps even watching this, the likely finish time will probably be between 60 and 90 minutes. And that in itself is very much what we tend to term as a threshold race or a threshold based effort. It's also very much a running race. 8 kilometers of this, about half of the time that people are on the course, is actually dedicated purely to running. So again, despite the images that you might have in your head of these extremely muscular physiques taking part in Hyrox, I think the landscape is going to change in the near future, in that the majority of the people that perform very, very well will be a lot leaner in the upper body, look almost more like pure runners, but will be able to run something like 31, 32-minute 10Ks in all likelihood. And that'll be what it takes to do, incredibly well at this sport. So if we look at the demands, and if I am right in my estimation of what's needed, it's about those physiological characteristics that allow you to undertake both running and the movement standards in the middle of the arena efficiently and at a high level without tiring, without fatiguing, without building up too much lactate and the metabolites that go alongside that. So what's necessary really is a high VO2 max. But a high VO2 max in itself is not sufficient to race well unless you can race at a high percentage of that. And that obviously brings us to the concept of threshold. That's essentially what threshold is. If we think of it in running terms, it's at best, it's your 10K pace. It's your best sustainable pace. And obviously we can apply that same notion, not just to the running portion of this race, but to the burpee broad jumps and the wall balls and the ski erg and so on and so on. Now, strength is obviously important, but strength is probably less important than people really think. Definitely, most of the movement standards in the middle of the arena are reliant on lower body strength. It's definitely necessary to have good glutes and quads and hamstrings and calves to be able to push and move the sledge, to be able to, carry the 20 to 30 kilo sandbag on your back to do lunges. But if you look at the actual movements, the resistance and the weight that's applied, it would be nowhere near somebody's 1 rep max. I think maybe the grip strength might be an area of weakness particularly for people who come to Hyrox from triathlon or endurance sports. It might simply be that the grip gives out because not only the ski erg, the rower, the sledge pull, and also the farmer's carry all need the grip to be reasonably strong. And obviously the additive effect of one of these movements after another can mean that by the time people get to the farmer's carry, the grip is starting to give out at that point. But for the other major muscles, despite again seeing people with a lot of muscle bulk upper body, there is not that much requirement to be extremely muscular to be able to move the sledges or to be able to move the wall ball, etc., and the sandbag. So strength is probably less of an issue. Now, if we look at that then and we define it as a sport that's defined by a good threshold and a good VO2 max, what sort of training should people employ if they're going to train for Hyrox? So firstly, if you want to lift your VO2, if you want to improve your maximal aerobic capacity, I'd probably suggest that you just choose single modalities. So rather than mixing or using Hyrox specific movements, I'd look at training the heart and lungs by movements that don't require too much technical skill, but are very big compound movements, which will drive the usage of oxygen and the blood pump up massively. So in triathlon, obviously, we could do this with with cycling or with running. Running just brings a slight injury risk with it because it means that you're going to be running under fatigue and running really quite fast. So cycling is definitely a good one. Using an echo bike or an assault bike where you're involving the upper body as well would be great. The rower, the ski erg, and any of the ergs involved in the sport of Hyrox would be absolutely fine as well. But I would tend to stick to one or at most swap between 2 of these. And again, just really focus on working working almost as hard as you can. You know, a VO2 max workout is at least a 9 out of 10, if not a 10 out of 10. Now, again, that can definitely be part of the program, but it isn't enough on its own because these efforts are a little bit too short and too intense. Remember, the sport of Hyrox lasts at least 60 minutes for the majority of the field. So threshold work is what we need to introduce there. And this would probably fill out the bulk of somebody's training for Hyrox. And when we're talking about threshold, we're talking about that anaerobic threshold, also called LT2. Now, here again, you could do like metabolic conditioning type workouts where you could use big compound movements and involve Hyrox specific training with lunges, with sledges, with wall balls. Equally, you could keep it just to running. Again, running is half of the race. So you certainly want your threshold run pace to be very high. And again, you could simply use the ergs. You could swap between rower and skier and assault bike, and you could build a workout around those. Now, again, with threshold workout, you could utilize one or two of them a week, maybe one running specific and one erg specific, or using the movements from Hyrox. And you would look to build a main set that's 30 to 50 minutes long, working more like a 7 out of 10, whereas we've called VO2 max more like a 9 or a 10 out of 10. And so that's going to be a major constituent of your training program pretty much year round. We still need to consider base training. You know, at the end of the day, we can improve threshold, we can improve VO2 max, and we can improve resilience by having a really good solid aerobic base. And this basically is that zone 1 to 2 easy training that feels no more than about a 5 out of 10. And here again, that would be great to build up the volume of running. It would help build your resilience and injury prevention. And again, we could use the ergs, but I would keep this base training to the cardiovascular modalities like cycling and swimming and running. I wouldn't tend to use weight training within this base sort of period. And again, base could be heavily weighted, well away from your race, or it might be something that you keep on top of all year round. And how much base you put into the week is obviously just down to planning and how much time you have available. But a lot of people come into this from more a weightlifting or a team sports environment, or perhaps from CrossFit, which is very, very common. This could be the area that sees them improve drastically. This lower effort level, but more continuous, long, slow distance kind of training. From a strength training perspective, again, for people who are not au fait with strength training, any form of strength training would be beneficial, particularly as I've highlighted around the major lower limb muscles, the major compound movements like squats, deadlifts, Bulgarian split squats, and so on and so forth, that train all of the major lower limb muscles together, maybe adding in some calf raises to specifically work on the calves. And also, upper body work, yes, to support the rest and to maintain a balanced physique, but particularly working on the grip. You will train the grip if you do some heavy lower limb movements like deadlifts, trap bar deadlifts, RDLs, but you could also add shrugs. You could add some bar hangs where you just hold your body weight on a bar as if you're going to do a chin up. And all of that will help to build grip strength, which is really important. But if you want to train this strength a little bit more specifically, or you've done strength training for quite a while, the two things I would suggest is that you think about the movements that are going to be required. And the two different movements, really, if we think about the sledges, where the movements are very slow with quite a heavy resistance, that will really benefit from the traditional heavy, slow weight training, where you control the bar down, you maybe pause at the bottom, and you control the bar back on its way up. So you really take your time to maintain tension on the muscle. And you can see how that would probably apply to those slower sledge movements where you're putting a lot of force on the sledge to push it forwards, but it isn't moving very quickly at all. You know, one 12.5 meter length takes maybe 30 seconds, 20 to 30 seconds to get across. And your step rate is really quite slow as you build tension against the sledge. So again, I think that would be useful, just traditional heavy, slow weight training. But the other movements where the resistance is lighter, so, you know, the wall balls, the lunges with the sandbag, particularly, and also the burpee broad jumps, here you're largely only using body weight and a little extra. So this would probably benefit from weight training that involves moderate weight, but moving quickly, being a little bit more explosive, you know, to get out of that burpee and go into a broad jump. And that takes a quicker movement. Again, to receive the wall ball, deep squat and back up again, it's not too heavy, but you are doing a lot of them, and the movement speed needs to be quite quick. So again, replicating that with a moderate weight and more speedy movements would probably be really, really useful. Of course, in that realm, you could look into plyometrics as well. And then, finally, in building a program out, you've utilized all these sort of physiological reasons to build your program. Probably the final thing would be to think about building some skill and looking at the technical aspects, particularly as far as things like the lunges are concerned. You can do that movement more efficiently. We know that we can improve run technique and move more efficiently while running. Similarly with the ski erg, the row machine, each has its own nuances and way that you can improve your performance without putting more effort in, but by just moving more economically and saving a little energy and using a skill-based approach to those as well. So if you were to think about all those things, that would make a great weekly training program for Hyrox, in my opinion. Again, avoiding the tendency to think that you need to be absolutely jacked. You need to be a better runner, and you need to be able to have a high threshold, either on its own or as a percentage of your VO2 max. So for some people, they'll need to do a little bit more base. For others, they'll need to do a little bit more VO2 at the top end. But either way, both sets of athletes will need to spend plenty of time training lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold. And as I mentioned earlier, that could be directly in running, because that is half the race, or it could be using both the ergometers, or it could be using specific Hyrox movements and working at that 7 out of 10, or if you've identified a heart rate that's appropriate, working at that particular heart rate. Well, there you go. That's my thoughts on Hyrox. Whether that will help my performances in the near future, I've got another race in about 6 weeks' time, I think it is. This is the sort of thing that I'm thinking about and what I'm now going to implement, and any improvement on my previous time would be gratefully received. So let's see if that works.